What's up guys, Landon here from the Full-Time Filmmaker team, and in this video I'm going to give you my 10 tips for shooting in low light. Now, I shoot in bright daytime environments about 80% of the time, but occasionally I do need to shoot in low light. And chances are you've also found yourself in a low light situation, and if you don't know some of the basic techniques to approaching this type of shooting environment, you're going to be stuck with some grainy, unusable footage. So to start out, my first tip is to make sure you have at least one light source. Now remember, this video is about shooting in low light, not no light, so you need to have at least one source of light to help bring some contrast and dimension to your scene. Now, depending on the environment that you're shooting in, there are probably quite a few natural sources that you could use to help light it up. For our little intro sequence, we had our campfire, the lights from the truck, and our subject's cell phones. Now, if we didn't have those lights to help create an interesting scene, and we just depended on our ISO to light everything up, we'd have an extremely flat image. So remember, you need at least one light source. So you have your light. Now, where do you put it? That brings me to tip number 2, light the shadows. Now, right now I'm being lit by this fire, so it's acting as a key light or my main source of light. This can be a good lighting technique for many situations, like obviously if you're filming a couple of friends sitting around the fire and you need a natural light source that can light both of them up. But frontal lighting like this isn't the only way to light your subject in the dark. In fact, unless it's a natural light source like the fire, I think generally it looks a little bit too staged and artificial. Another method of lighting your subject in the dark would be to light what's behind them instead, like some of these shots of our subjects setting up the fire. They have lights from the car shining on them from behind, which creates a nice rim light and separates them from the darkness. So you can use a combination of both frontal lighting and backlighting, or you can just use backlighting on your subject to really emphasize that it's nighttime. This is what I mean by light the shadows. You don't necessarily need to light your subject directly. A silhouette of your subject with an interesting background is really aesthetically pleasing, and it's going to give you a lot more contrast and depth in your image than just one frontal light. Now, if you take your camera and you try to expose for the shadows in your scene, it'll most likely introduce a lot of noise into your image. So rather than exposing for those shadows, expose more for the highlights and the midtones. Allow your shadows to be shadows. If your shadows are too dark, just find a way to light them up with some artificial lighting, like I mentioned in the previous tip. Tip number 4 is to use a wide aperture. Now, the lower the f-stop on your lens, the wider the iris will open and the more light will hit your sensor, therefore brightening your image. Now, this clip at f1.4 is perfectly exposed and there's plenty of light hitting my sensor, but if I were to bump it up to f5, for example, the entire image would get significantly darker. For that intro sequence, I shot all of it on Sigma f1.4 lenses. Prime lenses like these generally have pretty low apertures, so I'd recommend them over variable zooms for low light situations. I honestly think having a good fast lens that can at least get below f2 is the first thing you should look at on your setup, because it'll probably make the biggest difference out of any of these tips. My next tip is to use a slower frame rate. Now, if you shoot in a high frame rate, let's say 60 frames per second, you'll be forced to shoot at a shutter speed of at least 1/120, so your footage has proper motion blur. Now, a shutter speed of 1/120 brings in less light than if you were to shoot at 24 frames per second at a shutter speed of 1/50. Now, I'm not a big fan of lowering my frame rate because generally I like to shoot at 60 frames per second in case I need that slow motion, but sometimes you just have to deal with it because that small change in your shutter speed can mean the difference between a well-lit shot and an underexposed shot. The trick I like to use is to actually shoot at 30 frames per second with a shutter speed of 1/60, since the difference between that and 1/50 are very minimal. I'm always editing on the 24 frames per second timeline, so if I shoot at 30 frames per second, I can slow it down to 80% of its original speed and still get just a little bit of slow motion. Tip number 6 is to optimize your camera's ISO settings. Now, many cameras give you the option to activate built-in noise reduction to clean up some of that gross discolored splotchiness that you may experience when shooting at a high ISO. Now, Canon specifically has what's called high ISO speed noise reduction, so I'll generally have that turned on when I'm really pushing the ISO. My next tip is to choose a camera that does well in low light. Now, not all cameras are created equal. Some cameras, typically lower end models or cameras with smaller sensors, generally perform a bit worse than those with full frame sensors. Now, having a large sensor size will usually do better in the dark because it can catch more photons or light. Also, a feature to consider when choosing which camera you want to use is its ability to shoot RAW, since that'll give you more flexibility to adjust your exposure in post. Now, you'll still need to keep in mind the proper camera settings that we've already gone over and good lighting techniques, but RAW shooting can definitely give you a boost. Tip number 8 is to use a standard picture profile. Now, this tip is mostly for my log shooters. I really don't have anything against log, but because of the nature of log, you typically need to overexpose your image just a touch in order to utilize all of that dynamic range. image, something that number one is going to increase the amount of noise in your image, and number two isn't necessary because there generally isn't a lot of dynamic range when shooting in the dark anyway. Because it's so dark, you won't have enough data to actually expose your scene the way you need to. So unless you have artificial lights to help light up more of your environment, you may as well shoot in a standard profile like Rec. 709. On my 1DX2, I'm shooting in neutral, which is my go-to for most situations. And with this tip, I'm obviously speaking in a general sense, so you can gauge for yourself if it's worth shooting in log, but like I said, I tend to steer away from it, especially for low light shooting. All right, so now that our footage is shot and we've done everything we can to make sure it looks as clean as possible in camera, we can jump into our editing program and make a few adjustments until it looks extra crispy. When I'm color correcting low light footage, I like to go into my curves panel and bring up the highlights and the midtones. Now, naturally, I would want to be pulling up my shadows to try and get some of that detail back, but if you do that, you're going to introduce a lot more noise into those darker parts of your image. So I'll only typically bring this up just a touch. Now, the reason I focus more on the midtones and the highlights is because it creates a lot more contrast and depth into my final image. It's important to, once again, let your shadows be shadows and respect the lighting where your subject is located. There's no need to over-enhance it and make it look unnatural. All right, the 10th and final tip is to use a denoiser. So if you followed all of these tips and you still have a bit of noise in your image, I recommend using a denoiser plugin to clear it all up. Now, the one I use is from Red Giant and it's just called Denoiser 3. Now, honestly, this has been a lifesaver in several of my shoots. Sometimes there's just nothing you can do while on location to accommodate for low light, and you just have to deal with the splotchiness and fuzziness from your high ISO. Again, I'd recommend trying all of the previous tips that I've given first and just use Denoiser as a backup, mainly because while the cleaned up footage that you'll get is definitely usable, it might look a little bit artificial, almost like plastic. Plus, the plugin uses a ton of computing power to process your clips, so ideally you don't want to use it since it'll disrupt your workflow a bit. Now, if you're pursuing a career as a full-time filmmaker or it's something you've always been interested in, we have so many more videos like this one and videos that go even more in depth on every aspect of filmmaking. There's actually over 400 videos inside our online film course, Full-Time Filmmaker. So you won't only have access to that content, you'll also be connected to over 13,000 of our students inside our private Facebook group, where you can ask filmmaking related questions, get feedback on your work, and also receive mentorship from us and other seasoned filmmakers in the community. So click the link somewhere around here or in the description and level up your filmmaking skills today. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. And as always, if you have any further questions, please let us know.